Two visionaries before the automobile. In a Europe shaken by smokestacks, steam engines, and factories filled with metallic noise, the year 1844 finds a boy named Karl in the region of Baden, in the southwest of Germany. Growing up in an environment where the future seems tied to railway tracks rather than to open and unpredictable roads. His father works in connection with the train, that absolute symbol of progress. And for a child like Karl, watching locomotives cross the landscape is almost like peering into the border between reality and the science fiction of his time. A line that marks him deeply, because while many see only smoke and iron, he feels a mixture of fascination and questions that he still does not know how to formulate, but that push him to want to understand what lies beneath every bolt and every movement. Very soon, tragedy strikes the family with the death of his father. And that early morning not only forces him to mature, it also sharpens a conviction within him. If he wants to build something different, he cannot wait for the world to give him permission. With this backdrop, and while Germany industrializes at a pace that can sometimes be frightening, you and I find ourselves here many years later, trying to follow the thread of how one of the most powerful brands on the planet was born. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from what place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because in the end, these stories are enjoyed more when you know that on the other side, there are very different people connected by the same intrigue. And with that said, let us return to Karl, who still has no surnames in the newspapers nor resounding titles. Only an intelligence far above average, a mother who believes in him even when there is no money for grand fantasies, and a world that seems designed for those who dare to think in machines, calculations, and blueprints, rather than settling for a stable job and little more. From a very young age, Karl Benz stands out for a disarming ease with mathematics and mechanics, a type of talent that in that era can be a blessing, but also a burden, because it places you in an uncomfortable position. You understand how things work, but the environment is not yet ready for what you imagine could one day exist. He studies engineering at a time when that means facing blackboards full of formulas, professors who still think in terms of locomotives and static machines, and classmates who are looking for a secure job in railways, construction, or heavy industry. While he already senses that the engine can be something much more personal, something that can be carried with you, something that does not depend on rails. When he enters the working world, he does so like many entrepreneurs in history, in positions that are not his dream, but that allow him to learn, to take notes, to see from the inside the limitations of established technology, and to accumulate a mixture of frustration and ambition that will eventually push him to risk everything for an idea that still feels uncomfortable to almost everyone. While Karl advances along his path in another part of Germany, in the year 1834, Gottlieb Daimler is born, a child who grows up in a very different environment, but driven by a similar restlessness, an almost physical need to understand how to tame energy and turn it into efficient, precise, and controlled movement. Instead of obsessing over the railway, his youth is marked by artisanal workshops and mechanical precision, by that universe in which the smallest error ruins an entire piece, and where patience and obsession with detail are the daily currency. Daimler first trains as a gunsmith and craftsman, then as an engineer, and that journey gives him something that will be fundamental to his business vision: the ability to move comfortably both in the world of traditional manufacturing and in that of emerging technology, understanding that the future lies not in choosing one over the other, but in combining them in a way no one has yet explored. Gottlieb does not limit himself to working only on what he is asked to do, but begins to travel, to observe what is being experimented with outside his immediate environment, to approach companies and figures who are playing with gas engines and new ways of generating power. One of the key names in his story is Nicholas Otto, the man who perfects the four-stroke internal combustion engine, whose company, Deutz, becomes a kind of nucleus of talent for ambitious engineers. There, Daimler and his inseparable collaborator Wilhelm Maybach absorb knowledge at a dizzying speed. In that context, Gottlieb begins to develop an idea that will circle in his mind for years. The engine should not be a monster bolted to the ground, designed to move an entire factory, but a compact, light, and versatile machine capable of powering different types of vehicles, from carriages to boats, or, who knows, something completely new. Meanwhile, Carl Benz, from another trench of engineering, also begins to feel that working for others has a ceiling that is too low for what he imagines. He passes through several companies, changes cities, learns about bridges, locomotives, and industrial machines. But each experience seems to confirm the same thing. If he wants to take his vision further, he will have to create his own company, risk his scarce capital, accept that he will live a less comfortable, more uncertain life, but one infinitely more aligned with what he feels he has come to do. From that process comes the decision to form partnerships, to seek financial backers, even if that means giving up power and enduring tensions. Because the idea of the light engine and the self-propelled vehicle begins to demand more than nights of study and sketches on paper. It needs money, workshops, employees, suppliers, and everything that surrounds a true industrial project. In Daimler's trajectory, something very similar occurs. Once he becomes convinced that the compact engine is the future, he realizes that he will not be able to truly develop it if he remains under the umbrella of companies with conservative interests, companies that fear killing the goose that lays the golden eggs by chasing something too risky. For that reason, he ends up leaving seemingly secure positions to embark on an adventure of his own alongside Maybach. Starting almost from zero, working in improvised workshops, adapting tools, pursuing investors and potential clients who, before talking about money, must first be convinced of why anyone would want such a small machine that, in theory, would serve to move things that do not yet exist. That leap into the void, both personal and entrepreneurial, marks Daimler's character as an entrepreneur who does not seek only quick profits, but to leave a technological mark that changes the rules of the game. If we put these two trajectories together, that of Benz and that of Daimler, what emerges is not a romantic story of enlightened geniuses, but a much harsher and much more interesting reality. Two men living in a turbulent environment, losing security, arguing with partners, making mistakes with prototypes that do not work as expected, but refusing to give up because they feel, deep down, that the combustion engine can become the tool that frees transport from rails and rigid schedules. Neither of them yet knows that their names will end up united under a single brand, nor that their work will give rise to one of the most respected empires in the industry. They only sense that they are opening doors that did not exist before, and that for every new door, a new problem arrives that must be solved. And it is precisely at that point, when the technological vision is already clear, but the world still does not understand what these machines will be for, that the next chapter of this story begins to take shape. The moment when theory turns into practice, and the invention stops being a workshop experiment to face. For the first time, the definitive test of the road. The first automobile and Bertha's gamble. In the middle of the 1880s, when German cities begin to fill with horse-drawn tramways and factory smoke, Carl Benz is shut away in his workshop in Mannheim, struggling with a machine that looks as if it has stepped out of a poorly understood drawing, a light structure on 3 wheels, with a noisy engine mounted at the rear and a web of belts, chains, and metal parts that would make anyone doubt at first glance. He is convinced that what stands before him is the future of personal transportation. But every step he takes reminds him that there are no references, that there is no manual for creating something the world has not asked for, and that the doubts of his partners and his surroundings mix with a very simple fear. What if all of this ends up being an expensive and useless whim? The patent motor wagon, patented in 1886, is a complete oddity for its time. A vehicle resting on 3 thin wheels, driven by a single-cylinder internal combustion engine, with a speed that on paper is barely impressive, but that in conceptual terms breaks with centuries of dependence on the horse. It does not have a steering wheel as we understand it today, but rather a kind of tiller that turns the entire front axle, and whoever sits at the controls does not feel inside a carriage, but exposed, elevated, with the engine vibrating behind their back and every small stone on the road amplified through the chassis. The first trials are cautious, short routes, almost domestic, within a controlled environment, because legislation, safety, and social perception form a wall against which any attempt to take the machine into the real world crashes. Carl Benz, who moves through blueprints and equations with impressive confidence, does not find it so easy when it comes to selling the idea, to explaining to investors, authorities, and potential clients why someone should want a vehicle that consumes fuel, makes noise, breaks down, and seems far more fragile than a horse-drawn carriage. Official demonstrations go well in technical terms, but they generate more curiosity than desire. Those who approach to see it start and move a few meters feel they are witnessing a fairground trick, an interesting attraction, but one far removed from their daily lives. That mismatch between the potential of the invention and public perception begins to weigh on the company. And as the bank account steadily drops, the patience of the partners wears thin. In the midst of that economic and emotional whirlwind, one figure stands out, someone many entrepreneurial stories would mention only in passing, but who here plays a central role. Bertha, the wife of Carl Benz, a woman born in 1849 into a well-off family. With a combination unusual for the time of education, determined character, and practical spirit. Bertha is not a distant observer of her husband's technological adventure. She is involved from the very beginning, invests part of her own assets in the company, encourages him when the environment turns hostile, and above all, understands something that is sometimes hard to see from inside the laboratory. If people do not see the car in action, if they do not perceive it solving real problems, they will continue to regard it as an engineer's extravagance. While Carl focuses on refining technical details, improving carburation, fine-tuning gears, Bertha begins to take note of a different kind of problem: social incomprehension, fear of the unknown, the absence of a convincing story surrounding the invention. She knows the vehicle works. She has seen it move. She has felt the engine roar. But she also knows that this is not enough. That no product revolutionizes a market if its creator locks himself in the workshop and simply waits for someone to knock on the door to buy it. And from that intuition, an idea is born that will change the history of the company and, in the process, the perception of what it means to take a risk in the business world. In August of 1888, without warning her husband to avoid endless arguments, Bertha makes a decision that today we would call a radical marketing action, but that at the time is, above all, an act of personal courage. She will rise early, take her 2 sons, Eugen and Richard, climb into the patent motor wagon, and travel the distance between Mannheim and Pforzheim, her hometown, some 100 kilometers that at that time represent a considerable journey, along uneven roads and without any kind of infrastructure designed for self-propelled vehicles. She leaves a brief note for Karl with a reassuring message. But the essential part is not written. She is about to turn a prototype into the protagonist of the first great public demonstration that the automobile is viable for a long-distance journey. The dawn scene has something cinematic about it. The car prepared in front of the house, the silence of the still sleeping city, the expectant children, and a woman determined to face not only the bumps of the road, but also looks of disbelief, possible breakdowns, and the uncertain reaction of the authorities. Bertha starts the engine, adjusts the controls, pulls out into the street, and begins a journey in which every intersection, every incline, and every village is unknown territory. Neighbors who see her pass are astonished by that smoking structure moving without horses. Some cross themselves, some run alongside the vehicle. There are rumors that it is some kind of diabolical invention. For many, it is the first time they witness anything like it, and the image stays engraved in their memory forever. Of course, the trip is not a comfortable ride, and that is precisely where its value lies. The patent motorwagen needs fuel, a petroleum distillate called ligroin, and at that time this substance is not obtained at service stations, but at pharmacies that sell it as a cleaning product. Bertha stops in different towns, enters apothecaries, explains what she needs, buys the liquid in small quantities, and refills the tank, effectively turning a pharmacy in the town of Wiesloch into the first service station in the history of the automobile. The car suffers. The inclines sometimes require the passengers to get out and push. The brakes wear down so much that she herself decides to reinforce them with new leather at a cobbler's workshop. Improvising solutions along the way, like any entrepreneur forced to adapt a product to real-world use while testing it. There are small mechanical problems she solves with whatever she has at hand, such as a hat pin she uses to clean a clogged fuel line. And each decision builds a story that, told decades later, sounds heroic, but that in the moment is lived with the mix of tension and concentration that accompanies any pioneer when they realize they cannot fail halfway through the journey. Upon arriving in Pforzheim, exhausted but triumphant, Bertha sends a telegram to Karl to inform him that the trip has been a success, that the machine has endured, that doubts about the vehicle's ability to cover long distances are no longer a theoretical question, but a challenge overcome in real life. News of the journey spreads quickly, first as rumor, then as anecdotes told in cafes, in gatherings, in business circles. Later, it reaches the press, which amplifies the story of that woman who has traveled so many kilometers in a machine without horses. And that narrative triggers a profound shift in perception. The car ceases to be a strange experiment and becomes a tangible promise of personal mobility, an object that suddenly seems far more useful than exotic. Karl understands that his invention needs adjustments, introduces technical improvements inspired by Bertha's experience, such as an additional gear to tackle inclines more easily, and, most importantly, discovers that the key is not only to perfect the engine, but to find a way for people to see the potential of the entire concept. From the perspective of modern entrepreneurship, Bertha's journey is interpreted as a move far ahead of its time. A blend of product testing, advertising campaign, and market validation, carried out not in a meeting room, but in the open air, with dust on the face and real risk at every stretch of the road. It was not an impulsive romantic gesture. It was a sharp reading of the moment. If the market does not understand the proposal, you must create the experience that opens the market's mind, even if that means exposing yourself to criticism accidents, or ridicule. That day, the automobile ceased to be a laboratory invention and became a story anyone could tell. And that difference in business often marks the turning point between a brilliant failure and a success that is misunderstood at first, but consolidated over time. As the name Benz begins to resonate more strongly thanks to that legendary journey, and the concept of the automobile as a tool for real use gains ground. In another part of the map, the engines of Daimler and Maybach prepare to demonstrate their capabilities on a very different stage. One where speed, power, and competition will be the language they use to conquer the public imagination. Daimler, Maybach, and the idea of speed. While Carl Benz consolidates his invention as a practical tool designed to demonstrate that the automobile can replace carriages and travel real distances, Gottlieb Daimler advances along a different, almost parallel path, fixing his gaze on something that, in those years, sounds provocative: speed. His professional trajectory has led him to work with Nicholas Otto, the man who shaped the four-stroke internal combustion engine. And at Otto's company in Deutz, Gottlieb encounters a brilliant mind who will become his perfect partner for the years to come. Wilhelm Maybach, an engineer of humble origin, quiet, almost shy, but endowed with an extraordinary ability to transform theoretical concepts into concrete, clear, and above all, efficient designs. In the Deutz factory, one breathes the air of what could be called official innovation, an environment where large, heavy engines are developed, designed to move agricultural machinery, pumps, and industrial equipment. A type of technology that brings money and immediate recognition, but that for Daimler and Maybach begins to fall short in terms of ambition. They observe those iron giants that turn at low revolutions, anchored to the ground, and feel that something is missing there. That there is a hidden potential in the combustion engine that no one is truly exploring. The creation of compact machines, capable of turning at high revolutions, light enough to propel autonomous vehicles without depending on rails or fixed installations. That idea, which at first is little more than an intuition discussed in late-night conversations, will end up becoming the guiding thread of their entire careers. Tensions with the management of Deutz are not long in coming. The company wants stability, solid contracts, reliable engines that can be sold to traditional industrial clients, while Daimler and Maybach propose experimenting with smaller, riskier configurations that require resources and offer no immediate guarantees of profitability. In the end, the clash of visions becomes impossible to sustain, and Gottlieb chooses to resign from his position, seemingly comfortable and well paid, in order to pursue his own obsession. There is something deeply entrepreneurial in that gesture. Abandoning the security of a large company for a workshop in a house with a garden in Cannstatt, near Stuttgart, where he and Maybach transform an old shed into their private laboratory. Far from hierarchies, but also far from the financial backing they were used to. In that place, one of the most influential engines of the early history of the automobile is born. A small single-cylinder engine known as the grandfather clock, because of its elongated and slender shape, very different from the heavy iron monsters that dominated factories. This engine, completed around 1885, turns at far more revolutions per minute than conventional engines of the time. And that number of revolutions, which might seem like a technical detail, is the heart of Daimler and Maybach's vision. If they achieve a compact and fast source of energy, they will be able to place it on almost any moving platform. The idea of speed ceases to be a conceptual ornament and begins to translate into concrete solutions, into drawings of crankshafts, valves, carburetors, and lubrication systems that are increasingly refined. The first test comes with Daimler's famous motorcycle, a kind of reinforced wooden bicycle, with two main wheels and two small lateral wheels to maintain balance, powered by that compact engine roaring beneath the seat. In 1885, Gottlieb's son, Paul, rides several kilometers on that unstable vehicle, becoming unwittingly one of the first motorcyclists in history. The experiment, which seen from today may appear almost comical, is a powerful message in its context. The engine is no longer tied to the ground. It has ceased to be a static apparatus. It has transformed into an organ that can be mounted on different bodies to create new forms of movement. Shortly thereafter, that same engine is adapted for a boat, and later for a four-wheeled carriage, in a process that demonstrates the versatility of the technology that Daimler and Maybach have in their hands. Each new installation presents different challenges, from temperature control to the transmission of power to the wheels or the propeller. But it also opens doors to potential clients and commercial uses. Gottlieb's vision is not limited to building a car as such. He imagines a universe of vehicles driven by engines that turn fast and occupy little space. A world in which speed and compact energy become part of everyday life. However, that pioneering approach requires more than engineering. It requires a business structure capable of connecting those machines with people willing to pay for them. And here, a fascinating figure enters the scene from a business perspective. Emil Jelinek, born in 1853, a merchant, insurance broker, a man with a keen sense for business and a strong personality, Jelinek becomes one of the most demanding and at the same time most valuable clients for Daimler Motorengesellschaft, the company founded in 1890, with which Gottlieb and his partners seek to industrialize their developments. Jelinek lives part of his life on the French Riviera, in an environment of luxury, aristocracy, and new fortunes that find in the automobile a perfect symbol of modernity and status. He is not satisfied with cars that merely move. He wants machines that dominate roads and, above all, competitions. His obsession with speed fits perfectly with Maybach's philosophy, who sees racing as an ideal stage to test engines and chassis, push them to the limit, and accelerate technical development. Emil begins to sell Daimler cars to his select clientele, but at the same time, he imposes conditions, demands specific models, asks for more power, greater stability, innovations that make his vehicles clearly superior to those of other manufacturers. In that context, the name that will forever change the history of the brand emerges. Jelinek names his racing teams after his daughter, Mercedes, and begins to enter competitions with specially prepared Daimler vehicles under the designation Mercedes. Little by little, that name becomes associated in the public mind with fast, elegant cars, dominant in speed and endurance events. After one of those successes, especially in the races from Nice at the beginning of the new century, the commercial and symbolic weight of the name becomes so great that Daimler Motorengesellschaft ends up adopting it as a registered brand for its models, giving rise to a distinct identity that connects cutting-edge engineering, social prestige, and extreme performance. The concept of speed then transforms into a central element of the business strategy. Racing is not an expensive game for bored, wealthy people. It is a positioning tool. Every victory on a circuit or on a dusty road translates into orders, fame, press coverage, and cafe conversations in which a very simple idea is repeated. Those Mercedes cars run faster and endure more. Maybach designs lower chassis, more powerful engines, advanced cooling systems, all aimed at allowing vehicles to maintain high speed for longer periods without breaking down. And that technical demand reinforces another factor that will become a pillar of the brand for generations: reliability. Meanwhile, Gottlieb Daimler, who dies in 1890, does not live to see the magnitude of the phenomenon he helped unleash. But his legacy becomes evident in every new model that leaves the factories of Cannstatt and later Untertürkheim. The combination of Maybach's technical talent, Jelinek's aggressive commercial vision, and the technological foundations of the high-speed engine turned Mercedes into an early reference of what we would today call an aspirational brand, a symbol of status that speaks of economic power, a taste for risk, and confidence in modern engineering. The automobile ceases to be solely a tool for transportation and becomes an extension of the owner's personality, a visible declaration of who they are and how they wish to be seen. If we look at the map of this historical moment, on one side we have Benz focused on consolidating his automobile as a practical means of transport, demonstrating its usefulness with gestures such as Bertha's journey. And on the other side, Daimler, Maybach, and the Mercedes brand developing fast engines, conquering races, and seducing an elite fascinated by power. They are two paths advancing in parallel, with different business cultures and distinct commercial approaches, but both pushing in the same direction, expanding the concept of individual motorized mobility and forever changing the way people relate to distance. And that duality, sooner or later, will collide with the economic realities of an unstable Europe, forcing both stories to cross in a way that will definitively transform the landscape of the automobile industry. Two separate paths, the same destination. As the 20th century emerges with its mixture of euphoria, political tensions, and collective desires for progress, the stories of Benz and Daimler move forward along different routes that nevertheless seem pushed by an underground current toward a point of encounter. Benz and Kia, already consolidated as a company after years of effort, is sustained by Carl's vision as he continues to refine his concept of a practical, reliable automobile designed for everyday life. Daimler Motorengesellschaft, on the other hand, grows driven by the prestige of high-speed engines and by the overwhelming presence of Mercedes automobiles in the world of racing. From the outside, it might appear that they compete for opposite markets. But in reality, they are building piece by piece the two pillars that will later become the essence of a single brand: industrial functionality and sporting spirit. In the city of Mannheim, Carl Benz's company undergoes a curious evolution in which engineering blends with sales strategies that are still being invented on the fly. The first customers are pioneers by conviction, people who want to feel part of technological progress and who accept living with small breakdowns, fuel that is difficult to obtain, and roads designed for slow carts. Benz begins to manufacture increasingly robust models, adjusting suspension, improving ignition systems, and trying to simplify use so that any driver, even without deep technical knowledge, can travel without fear. The purpose is not to create an exotic object that only a few understand, but a vehicle that marks the beginning of a new normality. Something so integrated into daily life that over time, it becomes indispensable for millions of people. In Stuttgart, the situation is very different. Daimler Motorengesellschaft has become a bustling company, full of young engineers, ambitious investors, and executives who see speed as an opportunity to shine before all of Europe. Competitions in the early 20th century are held on dusty roads, on improvised circuits between towns, or along the Mediterranean coast. And each victory becomes a social event that appears in newspapers, in cafes, and in aristocratic gatherings. There, the automobile functions as a spectacle, a symbol of power and modernity. And the Mercedes brand is quickly associated with that feeling of technical superiority that impresses those who see it roar past the crowd. However, behind that sporting brilliance, there is a fragile business fabric exposed to economic swings and to considerable expenses in research and production. Racing models require enormous investments and a level of constant experimentation that, in financial terms, does not always compensate for commercial sales. Gottlieb Daimler Dies in 1890 and his son Paul, together with Wilhelm Maybach, must sustain technical leadership in a context in which every advance seems to demand an additional sacrifice. The company needs to consolidate itself in civilian markets, reach customers outside the racing world, sell engines for boats, for machinery, for taxis, and for industrial applications that allow the accounts to be balanced. Meanwhile, at Benz and Siaha, everything moves more slowly, more predictably, as if the company were advancing according to the philosophy of its founder, who always prioritizes stability and functionality over extreme risk. Carl Benz is a methodical, imprudent, and deeply disciplined engineer, a man who believes in the logic of progressive design and in the importance of building automobiles that withstand the passage of time. His company expands with larger plants, with organized processes, with a catalog that incorporates 2-seat and 4-seat models, vehicles for urban delivery, and even proposals designed for long journeys in an attempt to cover different niches without losing coherence. The brand gradually absorbs an image of reliability and sobriety that attracts a clientele seeking safety rather than extravagance. As the first years of the 20th century advance, the paths separating both companies begin to blur for a reason that does not depend on their business vision, but on historical circumstances. Germany enters a period marked by tensions among European powers, by labor conflicts, by economic instability, and by an arms race that forces industry to reorganize. The First World War breaks out in 1914 and profoundly alters all the productive structures of the country. Both Daimler Motorengesellschaft and Benz and C are forced to manufacture military vehicles, aviation engines, trucks for transporting heavy material, and all kinds of products intended to sustain the war effort. That period, which from a modern business perspective could be interpreted as a stage of accelerated growth driven by demand, has a disturbing reverse side. Once the war ends, civilian industry is weakened, resources are scarce, and companies face a sudden reduction of the market. The economic and social cost of the conflict leaves Germany in a fragile position, with inflation, unemployment, and purchasing power collapsed. In that panorama, the automotive industry is no one's priority, and buyers disappear rapidly. Benz and CE suffers especially from this brutal fall in demand. Its vehicles, designed as reliable tools, require a stable customer base, something practically non-existent in those post-war years. The company tries to sustain itself by reducing costs, optimizing processes, even revising contracts with suppliers. But the situation is so turbulent that it becomes difficult to maintain a clear direction. Carl Benz, already elderly and more distant from direct management, observes how the stability he had sought throughout his life wavers due to external factors impossible to control. Daimler Motorengesellschaft lives through a similar crisis, aggravated by the fact that much of its prestige was linked to an elite that has also lost economic power and seen its priorities change. Luxury automobiles become inaccessible. Racing ceases to be a relevant spectacle, and industrial orders decline. Wilhelm Maybach, a fundamental piece of the company's technical advance, leaves his design position after tensions with management, and his departure leaves a void that reveals the need for a deep reorganization. The Mercedes brand remains, but it needs a more solid structure in order to survive. It is in this atmosphere of uncertainty that both companies, weakened but still proud of their technological roots, begin to contemplate a possibility that decades earlier would have been unthinkable: joining forces. The need to scale production, share costs, unite distribution networks, and take advantage of technical synergies becomes evident. It is not a decision taken from enthusiasm for innovation, but from the awareness that, in order to survive, they must become something greater than the sum of two companies aging separately in an increasingly competitive environment. Negotiations begin in 1924. Driven by pressure from banks, by economic authorities, and by the growing conviction that neither of the two will be able to sustain itself alone, the merger is finalized in 1926, giving rise to a unified company that combines the industrial experience of Benz with the sporting and technical prestige of Mercedes. A union that marks a before and after for the German industry. Although cultural integration will be a challenge, the result opens the door to a stage in which the brand can redefine itself, reorganize its production, and present itself as a stronger actor in a European market that is still trying to rise from the ruins of war. What is interesting is that this convergence does not occur in an atmosphere of celebration, but in a climate where expectations, fears, and the feeling that the automotive world is entering a completely new stage are mixed together. Benz and Daimler had been born as different visions of the same dream, and now they had to learn to coexist under the same corporate direction. At that moment, the priority is not technical greatness, but strategic survival. And with this union forged out of necessity, a decisive phase begins in which the new company will have to prove that two legacies, so different in origin, can come together to build an identity capable of shining even in turbulent times. Racing, prestige, and the birth of Mercedes. When the calendar marks 1900 and the world looks toward a new century with a mixture of enthusiasm and vertigo, there is one place where modernity becomes brutally visible. Improvised roads turned into circuits, dusty routes that cross towns, mountains, and coastline, where men wearing leather goggles and pulled-down caps climb onto trembling machines that exceed speeds the average citizen has never experienced. In that setting, the legend of Mercedes is born as a synonym for prestige, because there, in long-distance races, much more than a trophy is decided. Reputations are built, newspaper headlines are fixed, and perceptions are shaped about which brand best embodies the future on wheels. Daimler Motor in Gesellschaft understands very early on that competitions are not an anecdotal form of entertainment, but a showcase that no advertisement could ever match. Unlike a brochure or a static announcement, a race from Nice to La Turbie or from city to city gathers thousands of people along the edges of the road, all focused on which car passes first, which one withstands the hardest climb, which one emerges from the dust with its engine still roaring. In that context appears the figure of Emil Jelinek, the merchant and insurance broker we have already encountered, who will end up being much more than a wealthy distributor settled on the French Riviera. Jelinek is an image strategist who understands that a well-chosen name can transform a product into a symbol. When Jelinek convinces Daimler that it needs automobiles designed expressly to win races, he is doing more than asking for more horsepower. He demands lower chassis, better brakes, high-performance engines, and above all, an aesthetic and technical coherence that makes those vehicles instantly recognizable. He enters the cars in different competitions using a name that has an intimate meaning for him, that of his daughter, Mercedes. And through sheer repetition in entry lists, sports chronicles, and conversations in elegant cafes, that word begins to detach itself from the person and become a brand charged with intensity, associated with victories, speed, and glamour. The first major strokes of impact arrive in the races held on the French Riviera at the beginning of the 20th century, where Mercedes automobiles designed by Wilhelm Maybach sweep several categories. These cars, commissioned by Jelinek with very precise specifications, blend elegance and aggressiveness, with low proportions, elongated lines, and engines that allow speeds the rest of the competitors cannot reach. The press describes their dominance in almost epic language. Illustrators capture in lithographs the image of these vehicles overtaking their rivals amid clouds of dust. And little by little, a clear idea takes hold. If you want a car that goes farther and faster, you buy a Mercedes. For Daimler Motorengesellschaft, this association has incalculable value. The company does not only sell cars, it sells reputation. It sells belonging to a reduced group of people capable of accessing the same technology that wins races, even though in everyday life, most of its clients will never compete. This phenomenon, which today anyone would recognize as a marketing strategy based on elite sport, is at that time built in an almost intuitive way. Driven by the ambition of engineers, the audacity of clients like Jelinek, and the public's fascination with watching machines push beyond limits that had seemed reasonable. At the same time, racing fulfills another key function for product development. It is an open-air laboratory. Every problem that arises on a circuit, every cooling failure, every tire that bursts, every brake that fatigues too early, becomes technical information that Maybach and his team use to modify designs, reinforce components, rethink geometries, and improve systems. The pressure of having to reach the finish line forces decisions that might have been postponed in a workshop. And that urgency imprints a very particular rhythm on innovation. The advances that survive the harshest tests end up filtering into road models, reinforcing the customer's sense of buying technology proven under extreme conditions. On the other side of the map, Benz & Company observes this phenomenon with a mixture of admiration and distance. Its approach has been from the beginning more practical and more cautious, oriented toward making the automobile reliable for the citizen who wants to travel between cities without surprises. However, the prestige of Mercedes in racing begins to influence the entire sector because it raises the standard of what the public considers possible. People no longer want only to move, they want to move quickly, with style, with the feeling of using the most advanced technology available. The automobile stops being a pure tool and becomes an expression of status, a reflection of the character and aspirations of its owner. The leadership of Daimler Motorengesellschaft detects that this powerful image linked to the name Mercedes is too valuable to keep solely within the realm of competition. And so it takes a further step and turns it into a registered brand. Starting in 1902, the company begins to commercialize its new models under that name, structuring a range that goes beyond racing cars to include vehicles for everyday use, with different power levels and body styles. But a shared conceptual seal, that of belonging to a family of automobiles that share their DNA with champions of the road. That move not only consolidates the brand, but demonstrates something fundamental from an entrepreneurial perspective. A company does not sell only products. It sells stories. It sells identities. It sells the sensation of being connected to something larger than the object itself. The emerging emblem of the three-pointed star, representing the ambition to dominate land, sea, and air with Daimler engines, begins to gain strength in parallel with the consolidation of the Mercedes name. One step still remains before both symbols are definitively united. But in the public imagination, a clear association is already taking shape between the star, fast cars, and German quality. That brand construction, gradual, fueled by sporting victories and presence in luxury markets, will become one of the great competitive advantages with which the future Mercedes Benz will enter the decades to come. Of course, the brilliance of racing does not shield the company from the economic and political turbulence that will arrive with the Great War and the post-war period. But it leaves behind a very powerful legacy, that of a brand which, even in difficult moments, retains a symbolic capital built on risk, spectacle, and technical excellence. Even if budgets are cut, even if tracks fall silent for a time, the idea that Mercedes cars have been the ones that win remains in the collective imagination, ready to be reactivated as soon as circumstances allow. That intangible capital will be crucial when, years later, economic necessity pushes Daimler, Motorengesellschaft, and Benz and Company to unite into a single entity. The prestige built on roads and circuits, the weight of the Mercedes name among elites, and the visibility of the three-pointed star will serve as the foundation on which to articulate a new corporate identity that brings together practical tradition and sporting ambition, silent engineering and public spectacle. And at that point, history turns toward a new stage in which we no longer speak of separate companies, but of a shared house that will have to learn how to make all those worlds coexist under a single name. Mergers, crisis, and the birth of Mercedes Benz. When the First World War ends in 1918, Germany awakens to an economic and social landscape that has little to do with the optimism of previous decades. And in this new scenario, the automobile factories that had shone during times of growth suddenly find themselves surrounded by ruins, debt, and a market that is no longer willing to pay for luxury cars while it struggles, quite literally, to eat and heat its homes. Daimler Motorengesellschaft, with its three-pointed star associated with speed and prestige, and Benz and Company, with its reputation for reliability and sober engineering, are caught in the same storm. Runaway inflation, a German mark that loses value week after week, and a country in which motorized mobility ceases to be a mass aspiration and becomes a luxury for very few. The post-war period hits especially hard those industries that had worked for the military effort. Because when the conflict ends, many public contracts disappear. Factories are hastily reconverted, and companies are left with machines, facilities, and workers prepared for large-scale production, but without enough orders to fill installed capacity. In the case of Daimler Motorengesellschaft, which during the war had manufactured aircraft engines, military vehicles, and trucks, the transition to civilian products implies a highly complex restructuring, in which every production decision is at the same time a bet and a financial risk. At Benz and Company, the situation is similar, with the difference that its more conservative corporate culture leads it to move with extreme caution, which protects it from certain excesses, although it also exposes it to the slow agony of insufficient demand. At the beginning of the 1920s, German hyperinflation becomes legendary, to the point that banknotes lose value in a matter of days and prices rise at a pace that is difficult to imagine today. An environment in which selling something as costly as an automobile requires almost accounting acrobatics and constant negotiations with banks and distributors. Many small automotive companies go bankrupt. Others are absorbed quietly. And a few, those with truly distinctive technology and a brand with some emotional weight, manage to stay afloat by negotiating credit, reducing workforces, closing production lines, and postponing projects. In this climate of instability, both Daimler Motorengesellschaft and Benz and Company begin to receive the same recommendation from different directions. If they want to survive in the medium and long term, they need to gain size, share costs, unify distribution networks, and reduce domestic competition, which in such a weakened market becomes almost suicidal. Bankers, economic authorities, And some executives with strategic vision begin to openly consider what for years had been almost a taboo. The possibility that the companies representing the legacy of Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, two pioneers with different biographies and philosophies, might end up walking under the same corporate roof. Before reaching the definitive merger, an intermediate step takes place that is very interesting from a business perspective. A kind of dress rehearsal meant to demonstrate whether cooperation is viable. In 1924, both companies sign a collaboration agreement that affects key areas: joint purchasing of materials, coordination of certain technical development processes, combined use of some sales structures, and above all, a basic strategic alignment to avoid stepping on each other's ground. This pact, which in theory keeps each company as an independent entity, works as a thermometer that allows compatibilities and frictions to be measured. And what is quickly detected is that synergies are not a theoretical concept, but something very tangible in a context where every saved mark counts. The 1924 agreement reduces costs, stabilizes the accounts to some extent, and shows that the combination of Mercedes' sporting prestige and the image of practical quality associated with Benz makes sense in the eyes of the market. Because it does not create confusion, but rather a sense of complementarity. On one side, a star that shines in competition and in the highest segments. On the other, a name linked to reliability in use, to cars that withstand years of service. At the same time, it becomes clear that maintaining two complete executive structures, two parallel management networks, two decision-making bodies for investments in a country battered by crisis is a burden too heavy even for companies with such long histories. The formal merger arrives in 1926 with the creation of Daimler-Benz Aktiengesellschaft, the new company resulting from the union of Benz & Company and Daimler Motorengesellschaft, which brings together factories, patents, engineering teams, and sales networks under a single legal entity. From an emotional standpoint, the gesture is very powerful. The surnames of Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler are joined in the corporate name, while the products that reach the market do so under the Mercedes Benz designation, integrating the name already charged with prestige with the surname of the pioneer who had placed Germany on the automotive map. It is an operation that combines hard business logic with a very fine reading of symbols, something crucial in an industry where the brand is often the difference between selling and going unnoticed. Along with the new name comes a renewed emblem that blends elements from both legacies. Daimler's three-pointed star is surrounded by a laurel wreath, a motif that came from the Benz logo, creating a shield that, at a glance, condenses speed, ambition, and victory. It is not a simple exercise in graphic design. It is a visual declaration that what was once dispersed is now offered as a unified force, prepared to speak with a single voice to customers, distributors, and governments. Decisions of this kind, which might seem superficial, are fundamental in moments of deep change because they offer a clear narrative to everyone involved in the transition. Inside the new Daimler-Benz Aktiengesellschaft, cultural and operational integration is not easy. There are differences in ways of understanding management, in leadership styles, in product priorities, and even in the pride of those who feel that their original brand has, in some way, been diluted. Integrating workforces, harmonizing salaries, reorganizing engineering departments to avoid unproductive duplication, and at the same time preventing key talent from leaving the company becomes a task of constant balance. Executives must convince former rivals that they are now part of the same project, and that conversation is not resolved in a single meeting. It is worked on for years through small decisions, in the way resources are allocated, in listening to the sensitivities of each group. From an industrial point of view, the merger enables something that had previously been almost impossible. Planning a coherent product range that covers high-end passenger cars, commercial vehicles, trucks, buses, and special applications, taking advantage of the accumulated experience on both sides. The new Mercedes Benz can develop shared platforms, use engines adapted to different segments, and negotiate supplies in larger volumes, which gives it a much stronger position with suppliers and against foreign competition, which in those years begins to grow strongly in countries such as France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In terms of branding, the union of surnames and symbols makes it possible to build an attractive story for the customer. Whoever buys a Mercedes Benz acquires an automobile that carries in its DNA the first motorized wheels of Carl Benz, the high-speed engines of Daimler, the sporting victories of Mercedes, and the solidity of a manufacturer that has survived a devastating war and an extreme economic crisis. That historical density, well told, becomes a sales argument that goes far beyond the technical specifications of each model. As the second half of the 1920s advances, the new company begins to stabilize and prepares for a phase in which engineering will once again have the opportunity to shine. Designs become more elegant. Bodies adopt lines that begin to dialogue with the aesthetics of the era. And engineers explore innovations in brakes, suspensions, and engines that will place the brand at the forefront of global technology. It seems that, at last, Mercedes Benz has found a point of balance between tradition and modernity, between industrial prudence and ambition for prestige. However, history does not unfold in a vacuum, and that period of apparent consolidation is about to be crossed by political and social forces that will profoundly transform Germany and all of Europe, pushing the automotive industry to play a role that mixes luxury, propaganda, and technology in a combination as brilliant as it is unsettling. Luxury, innovation, and shadows before the war. During the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s, with the merger already consolidated and the Mercedes-Benz brand beginning to settle in people's minds as a synonym for quality and prestige, Germany lives through a strange pendulum between euphoria and collapse, between the sparkle of crowded cafes, cabarets, and the urban life of the Weimar Republic, and the increasingly evident sense that, beneath that surface, profound changes are being prepared. In this ambiguous context, the company strives to show the world its most sophisticated face. Elegant automobiles parading along major avenues, engines that invite drivers to cross entire countries with a level of comfort previously unknown, and a design language that begins to detach itself from the purely functional forms of the past to flirt with the aesthetics of modern luxury. The catalogs of the period display long, refined sedans, with interiors cared for down to the smallest detail, and an imposing presence that fits perfectly with the clientele that can afford them. Industrialists, bankers, renowned artists, public figures who find in the automobile an extension of their social position. At the same time, Mercedes-Benz engineers continue to advance in something that will be central to the brand's identity for decades: technology as a core argument. Experiments are carried out with hydraulic brakes. 6- and 8-cylinder engines are refined. Work is done on stiffer chassis and on safety elements that are advanced for their time, because the company intuits that the future of its reputation will depend on cars not only looking good, but continuing to operate with precision after thousands of kilometers. At the peak of this stage appears the figure of the representative automobile. Those large models equipped with powerful engines, bodies built by artisanal coach builders, extensive chrome detailing, and features that speak of exclusivity. These vehicles become recurring images in the press, transporting heads of state, monarchs, diplomats, and influential figures from different countries. The automobile is no longer merely a means of transport. It is a piece of the scenery of power, part of political theater, of protocol, of official photographs. The three-pointed star on the radiator grille begins to appear at key moments of European public life. And this kind of exposure reinforces the brand's prestige in international markets. But while the company consolidates itself as a manufacturer of luxury and innovation, Germany enters a political drift that changes everything. The crisis of 1930, with financial collapse and mass unemployment, erodes confidence in the Weimar Republic and opens the path to the rise of the National Socialist Party. In 1933, with Hitler's arrival to power, a project of total reorganization of the country begins, which includes industry as a central pillar. For a manufacturer like Mercedes Benz, this means contracts, plans, commissions, an increasingly close relationship with the state that promises economic stability in exchange for alignment with the needs of the regime. The company, like many large German enterprises, is drawn by the possibility of filling its factories with regular orders. Trucks, special vehicles, engines for military uses, platforms adapted to different requirements of the war machinery that is being prepared at an accelerated pace. Even though in those early years there is still talk of defensive rearmament and national recovery, the Untertürkheim plant and other facilities begin to operate at a pace that restores employment to thousands of workers. Investments are made to expand productive capacity, and, at least on the surface, there is a climate of industrial rebirth that contrasts with the desperation of the early years of the decade. However, this expansion carries a high moral cost. The Nazi regime turns the automobile into an instrument of propaganda, both in its popular version, with projects such as the People's Car, and in its elite version, with large parades in which party leaders travel in Mercedes Benz limousines surrounded by flags, uniforms, and mass choreographies. The image of the brand becomes inevitably linked to these scenes, to those open-top vehicles in which leaders are seen greeting crowds organized in carefully staged events. From the company's point of view, these are contracts and visibility. From a historical perspective, this visual association will be permanently engraved in collective memory. In addition, as the country prepares more openly for war, the productive model hardens. The economy is oriented toward autarky. State controls are intensified. Entrepreneurial freedom of decision is limited in many respects, and very ambitious production targets are imposed. In this race toward conflict, many German factories, including Mercedes Benz, will end up using forced labor and compelled foreign workers, something that will unfold in all its brutality during the Second World War, but whose mechanisms begin to take shape already in the final years of the 1930s. The company, immersed in the machinery of a totalitarian state, becomes trapped between the need to survive, the desire to maintain its technological leadership, and the reality of collaborating with a brutal political project. Despite this growing shadow, from a technical and product standpoint, the period prior to the outbreak of the war is one of significant advances. Models that will later be considered classics are consolidated. Experiments are conducted with aerodynamic bodies inspired by aviation. High-performance engines are perfected, and participation in Grand Prix competitions is maintained, where Mercedes Benz, alongside Auto Union, competes with its Silver Arrows, racing cars that look like futuristic vessels far ahead of their time. These machines, extremely fast, are tools of international prestige for the regime. But they are also proof that the brand's engineers are at the absolute forefront of mechanical knowledge. This duality between technical excellence and involvement in an increasingly aggressive and criminal political system is one of the most complex aspects of Mercedes Benz history during these years. From the perspective of entrepreneurship and business management, it raises uncomfortable questions about the extent to which a company can abstract itself from the environment in which it operates, about the ethical limits of collaboration with power, about the responsibility of executives who make decisions amid enormous economic and political pressures. Decades later, the company itself will commission historical investigations and acknowledge this stage as a period in which its industrial success was intertwined with one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. While dealerships continue delivering luxury vehicles to wealthy clients and specialized magazines praise the quality and refinement of the most exclusive models, reality slides toward a situation of maximum tension in Europe. The signs accumulate: accelerated rearmament, annexations, constant diplomatic crises. Mercedes-Benz factories operate at full capacity. Assembly lines are reconfigured to meet orders increasingly oriented toward military uses. And the country launches itself toward a conflict that, in the span of only a few years, will transform those same production centers into bombing targets and leave the company facing a challenge that will once again test its ability to survive devastation. War, destruction, and reconstruction from zero. When in 1939 war breaks out in Europe and the conflict spreads like a stain of oil across the map, the Mercedes-Benz factories are already part of the industrial machinery of the German regime. And what until then had been a combination of luxury, prestige, and state contracts is transformed into an almost total commitment to the war machine. The plants in Untertürkheim, Sindelfingen, Gaggenau, and other facilities are rapidly reconfigured to produce military trucks, special vehicles, aviation engines, and strategic components. While commercial priority, as the company had understood it in previous years, is pushed into the background, replaced by production plans dictated from government offices where the word war organizes every decision. In the first years of the conflict, industrial activity lives through a striking paradox. The factories operate at full capacity, the assembly lines are crowded, orders follow one after another, and production figures reach levels that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Yet all that economic dynamism is in the service of a devastating project. Vehicles bearing the star on the grille transport troops, supplies, and weapons, travel through occupied territories, and form part of endless convoys. Aviation engines assembled under the Daimler Benz name power aircraft that bomb cities and distant fronts. From a business perspective, the machines do not distinguish between uses. They simply fulfill their function. But history does distinguish, and that distinction will fall upon the company with full weight after 1945. As the war progresses and the war effort intensifies, the availability of voluntary labor declines because many workers are called to the front and the regime resorts to increasingly brutal formulas to sustain production. In the Mercedes-Benz plants, as in so many other German industries, forced foreign workers begin to appear. Prisoners of war and, over time, people coming from concentration camps, integrated into a system of forced labor that today is unbearable to imagine, but which at that moment is normalized in reports, lists, and agreements with Nazi authorities. The company, immersed in that logic, organizes barracks, shifts, and controls to maintain the pace of manufacturing. And although decades later it will acknowledge this reality through investigations and public statements, in those years, each day of production adds another layer to the historical responsibility it will carry into the future. Meanwhile, the conflict changes direction. From 1943 onward, the war approaches German territory, and the factories, which at first seemed far removed from the front, become priority targets for Allied bombings. Mercedes Benz facilities, with their vast roofs, assembly lines, and warehouses loaded with materials, appear marked on military maps as points to be destroyed in order to weaken the logistical capacity of the enemy. Air raid sirens become part of the everyday soundscape. Workers descend again and again into underground or improvised shelters, and shifts are interrupted in the middle of a weld, an assembly, or an engine test. The aerial attacks soon leave deep scars. Entire halls are reduced to rubble. Precision machinery is destroyed by fire. Technical archives are consumed by flames, and internal transport lines are cut by craters and fallen beams. The company's management, forced to maintain production despite the damage, begins to disperse part of manufacturing to secondary facilities and smaller workshops in rural areas. A strategy of decentralization that seeks to prevent a single bombing from completely paralyzing activity, but that at the same time fragments processes, complicates logistics, and leaves the company living in a permanent state of improvisation. Working conditions deteriorate at an accelerated pace. Materials are scarce. Raw supplies arrive with enormous delays. Parts are reused, machines are repaired again and again, and everything that can still turn, cut, press, or weld is exploited. Workdays stretch longer, while on the political and military planes, Germany's situation collapses. And each day, it becomes more evident that defeat is only a matter of time. In the end, the very industrial capacity that had fueled the war becomes one of the most visible victims of the conflict. When in 1945, Allied troops occupy the country, many Mercedes Benz plants are a landscape of twisted iron, open walls, and blackened structures. The end of the war does not bring immediate calm, but radical uncertainty. Company executives are interrogated. Their participation in the war effort is reviewed. Partial or total dismantling of German heavy industry is considered. And for a time, the question hanging in the air is devastating. Will it make sense to rebuild these factories? Or will the world prefer that they disappear forever as part of the punishment of a country that has caused a disaster of unprecedented dimensions? The Allied occupation imposes strict restrictions. Blueprints are confiscated. The movement of machinery is supervised. Production capacities are analyzed. And meanwhile, surviving workers, many of them demobilized from the front or returned from extreme situations, arrive at the remains of the plants trying to understand whether they still have a place to earn a living. In that context, the first decisions begin to emerge that will mark the future of Mercedes Benz. The occupation authorities, especially in the zone controlled by the United States and its Western allies, conclude that the reconstruction of Germany requires the reactivation of essential parts of its industry, always under strict supervision that prevents any concealed rearmament. The repair of facilities is gradually authorized. The manufacture of simple civilian products is allowed, and certain bans on automotive production are lifted. First for commercial vehicles, and over time, for passenger cars. The company is forced to redefine its purpose in a world where the word luxury has no immediate meaning, but where mobility and the transport of goods are urgent to feed, clothe, and rebuild cities. The first steps of this new stage have something heroic and precarious at the same time. Engineers and workers rescue useful machines from among charred remains, fix presses with improvised parts, assemble temporary lines in half-repaired buildings, and find ways to put vehicles back into motion based on pre-war designs, such as a robust, medium-sized sedan that can be adapted both for civilian use and for public services and company fleets. This is not about creating spectacular cars, but about manufacturing something that works again, that moves, that proves the company is not dead. The three-pointed star reappears on grills crossing streets still filled with ruined buildings, horse-drawn carts, and overloaded bicycles, composing a strange image of continuity and rupture. In parallel with material reconstruction, a more subtle and slower process begins: moral reconstruction. During the years immediately following the war, the entire country passes through a kind of collective anesthesia, in which what is urgent is to survive, to obtain food, to avoid disease, to repair roofs, to find work. Only with the passage of time will deeper debates arise about the responsibility of companies that collaborated with the previous regime, about the use of forced labor, about photographs of vehicles parading in propaganda events that are now observed with a mixture of shame and distance. Mercedes Benz, like many large German companies, will take years to fully confront this part of its history. But the traces are already present in archives, in testimonies, and in decisions that weigh on the conscience of those who participated and of those who inherit that legacy. From an entrepreneurial point of view, the stage that opens in the years immediately after 1945 is unique. The company, which for decades had defined itself by its capacity to innovate and to lead the high-end market, must learn to operate almost from nothing, with minimal resources, in a morally devastated country, under the control of foreign powers, and with an image associated with a past many prefer to forget. It is an extreme exercise in resilience and reinvention, in which every production and design decision carries a component of survival, but also a potential seed of the future. Because what is being rebuilt among ruins is not only a car manufacturer, but an industrial platform that could become, if it plays its cards well, one of the engines of the economic rebirth of post-war Germany. Little by little, through that mixture of technical pride, adaptability, and the raw need to move forward, the Mercedes Benz factories will begin to leave behind the role of silent ruins and transform once again into productive centers. And from that industrial rebirth will emerge a new generation of models that will become symbols of a country trying to rebuild itself and regain the trust of the world. The German miracle and the new Mercedes. In the second half of the 1940s, when the smoke of war begins to dissipate and West Germany slowly pulls itself back together with a desperation that is hard to hide, Mercedes-Benz finds itself in a situation that would have seemed unimaginable to those who remembered the brilliance of the 1930s. Partially destroyed factories, shortages of materials, engineers who have survived the front lines or the bombings, and a brand carrying the heavy burden of having been part of the war industry of a defeated regime. And yet, beneath that layer of ruin and guilt, something essential has not disappeared. A combination of technical knowledge, industrial organization, and a deep culture of work that, if redirected toward a different horizon, can become the engine of a very profound recovery. That contained energy is precisely what will fuel, a few years later, what becomes known as the German economic miracle. And within that process, the three-pointed star will once again occupy a very visible place. The first steps back toward normality are surprisingly modest. In workshops that are only partially restored, pre-war designs are taken up again, such as the 170V, a robust passenger car that can adapt to almost anything. Ambulance, van, taxi, official car, or private vehicle for those who still have the means to acquire one. There is no room for grand design fantasies. The priority is that people can move, that companies and authorities have transportation tools to rebuild cities, distribute food, and reactivate commerce. The image of these first post-war Mercedes cars is very different from the arrogant luxury of the 1930s. Many units wear simple bodies, basic finishes, and the air of a tough, almost austere tool, perfectly aligned with the mood of a country trying to rise again from nothing. Little by little, as the Marshall Plan injects resources into Western Europe and the economy begins to breathe, the company finds itself in a more favorable environment to recover its original identity. The German mark stabilizes, new export opportunities emerge, and domestic demand grows alongside a middle class that, through effort, begins once again to imagine a future in which the automobile can be more than just a means of transportation. In that context, a word soon appears in every economic chronicle: Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, a phenomenon that turns the Federal Republic of Germany into one of the industrial locomotives of the continent in a surprisingly short time. Mercedes Benz places itself on the front line of that rebirth with a very clear strategy: to regain trust through quality. It is not enough to produce more, it is necessary to produce better, to prove that vehicles can withstand years of intensive use without losing dignity, to convey the idea that the brand represents serious, reliable, and rigorous engineering, detached from the ideological excesses of the past. The range is renewed with models known as Ponton, named for their self-supporting bodywork, safer and more modern. Introducing soft and balanced lines very different from the separate chassis and body silhouettes of earlier eras. This structural change is not an aesthetic whim. It increases rigidity, improves road behavior, and lays the foundations of a technical identity in which form and function advance in the same direction. Alongside these everyday passenger cars, another product line grows that will have enormous importance for the company's economic health: commercial vehicles. Trucks, vans, and buses from Mercedes Benz begin to fill the roads of Western Europe, carrying goods, connecting towns, and supporting logistics companies and public services. Every kilometer traveled by these vehicles reinforces the idea that the brand is synonymous with work done well, with machines that endure constant punishment and that, although they break down like all mechanical things, do so less frequently and with stronger technical support. From a business perspective, that combination of aspirational passenger cars and robust commercial fleets creates a very solid financial balance. While in its own country the star becomes associated with the everyday effort of reconstruction, on the other side of the Atlantic, a different story begins, one filled with aspiration and exotic appeal. The United States has become the great economic power of the post-war world, and on its highways reign gigantic sedans and locally built coupes with large displacement engines, exuberant chrome, and a very particular cult of the automobile. Entering that market is not easy, but Mercedes Benz finds an intelligent angle, offering something different, a combination of precise European engineering, more contained size, and an image of almost aristocratic prestige. The first importers and distributors, among them visionary figures such as Max Hoffman, begin to promote the brand among wealthy clients who love European culture and sober design. The great turning point for that strategy arrives with a model that becomes an instant myth: the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, presented in the middle of the 1950s. Derived from a competition car that had shone in endurance races, the 300 SL brings to the road a lightweight tubular space frame and an inline six-cylinder engine with direct fuel injection, something highly advanced for a production vehicle at the time. Its vertically opening doors, rising like seagull wings to allow access to a very low cabin, hypnotize the public from the very first day. The specialized press is captivated by its performance, its design, and its clear link to the world of racing. And suddenly the brand stops being only a symbol of efficiency and becomes an object of desire all over the world. That car opens a stage in which Mercedes-Benz learns to play on two seemingly different but deeply connected levels: that of the dream automobile that appears in magazines, films, and collectors' garages, and that of the reliable vehicle used daily by doctors, taxi drivers, civil servants, and business owners. While the 300 SL is displayed as the ultimate expression of sporting luxury, the brand's diesel taxis cover hundreds of thousands of kilometers, especially in Europe and in markets such as Greece, Turkey, and various countries of the Middle East, earning a legendary reputation for durability. That duality builds a very powerful narrative. The company that makes the most solid cars for work is the same one that creates almost sculptural machines for those seeking something unique. In Germany itself, the automobile bearing the star becomes an emblem of a new national identity, less marked by the aggressive nationalism of the past and more by the discreet pride of reconstruction. Having a Mercedes parked in front of a house or a small factory is interpreted as a sign that the venture has managed to consolidate, that years of effort have borne fruit. The car becomes a symbol of achievement without the need for excessive ostentation, a kind of silent medal that many entrepreneurs, artisans, and professionals award themselves when their activity reaches stability. Design style contributes to that reading. Far from the chromed extravagances of some American models, Mercedes cars of the 1950s combined sobriety and elegance in very carefully calculated proportions. Clean lines, balanced shapes, interiors that are refined but not overloaded, and a sense of solidity perceived in the sound of a door closing or in the feel of the controls. That visual coherence reinforces the idea that the brand does not change course with every passing fashion, but follows a path of constant evolution, refining details, incorporating technology when it is mature, and avoiding gestures that might put its reputation at risk. At the management level, the company takes advantage of the economic boom to invest in research and development, without falling into the temptation to grow at any cost. Plants are expanded, production processes are modernized, increasingly demanding quality controls are introduced, and an international after-sales service network is built that will be key to conquering distant markets. It is not only about selling cars on another continent. It is about ensuring spare parts, mechanic training, and the confidence that any problem can be resolved. That long-term vision, which may appear conservative, is in reality a very sophisticated way of understanding entrepreneurship in a capital-intensive sector. Competitive advantage is not built only in the factory, but also in how the customer is supported over many years. As the 1950s advance, the automotive landscape of Europe and the world fills with new brands, with competitors who begin to present interesting proposals in different segments, and the automobile ceases to be an exceptional object to become a mass aspirational product. To remain at the top, Mercedes Benz has to go one step further and find a territory in which it can lead without dispute. That territory will emerge linked to two concepts that will end up defining the brand for decades: advanced safety and engineering, applied with an almost obsessive ambition in its most representative models, those that set the direction for the rest of the range. Safety, engineering, and the S-Class. In the 1950s and 60s, as Europe grows accustomed to a life in which the automobile is already becoming part of the everyday landscape, traffic accidents multiply at an alarming rate. Roads are not prepared, regulations are rudimentary, and many manufacturers focus on selling power and style without paying much attention to what happens when things go wrong. In that context, within Mercedes-Benz, a line of thinking emerges that will change the way automobiles are conceived around the world. An obsession that gradually gains weight in offices, laboratories, and test tracks. The idea that safety cannot be an accessory. It must become a central part of the product, something as defining as design or the engine itself. A key figure in this transformation is Béla Barényi, an Austro-Hungarian engineer who arrives at the company with a vision so far ahead of its time that many consider it almost extravagant when he first presents it. Bertha argues that cars can be designed with crashes in mind from the very beginning, that the structure should not be a rigid, immovable mass, but rather a set of zones with different functions, areas that absorb impact energy by deforming in a controlled way, and a central passenger cell that remains as intact as possible to protect the occupants. What he proposes is a silent revolution in an industry that still associates strength with absolute rigidity. And convincing management that it is worth investing in this idea requires patience and enormous faith in one's own judgment. Over the years, that theory takes shape in concrete patents and, more importantly, in real cars. Mercedes Benz builds structures with programmed deformation zones, front and rear sections designed to crumple in a way that dissipates the force of an impact before it reaches the compartment where people travel. The concept of the safety cell, that rigid cabin meant to remain stable even when the rest of the car is destroyed, becomes the cornerstone of Bertha's approach. To prove its effectiveness, the company sets up crash laboratories where prototypes collide again and again with barriers, columns, and obstacles, while cameras, sensors, and technicians record every centimeter of deformation. It is not a pleasant spectacle, but from those repeated impacts comes information that will save lives on the road, while passive safety is quietly reinforced. The upper range of Mercedes Benz begins to take shape as a family of representative models, large sedans that will soon be recognized as the pinnacle of the brand. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, three-box body designs, spacious interiors, and six-cylinder engines draw a silhouette that many start to identify as the big Mercedes. The car aspired to by those who want more than a merely functional automobile. These models, known internally by codes such as W111 or W112, incorporate many of Bertha's safety ideas, from deformation zones to padded dashboards, laminated windshields, and steering wheel designs intended to reduce injuries. The customer, who may not know all the technical details, perceives something simpler but powerful. When closing the door and sitting behind the wheel, they feel better protected. At the same time, the company begins to work on the concept of active safety, everything that helps prevent an accident before it happens. Suspension and steering systems are improved, brakes are refined, tires are studied, more effective lighting is introduced, and above all, the development of technologies that today seem almost basic is promoted, but that at the time sound like applied science fiction. Anti-lock braking, traction control, electronic devices capable of intervening in thousandths of a second to maintain control in critical situations. In the 1970s, as a result of close collaboration with Bosch, Mercedes-Benz launches what is considered the first anti-lock braking system for passenger cars available in series production, a technology that debuts in the high-end sedans and, over time, spreads throughout the range. All of this experimentation is concentrated very clearly in a product that, from the 1970s onward, will become the company's rolling laboratory and the reference for the rest of the premium manufacturers in the world. The S-Class. Although the lineage of large sedans existed before, in 1972 Mercedes-Benz decides to organize and name its ranges in a more systematic way. And the letter S, from Sonderklasse, special class, is reserved for the flagship, the model where the most ambitious advances in comfort, safety, design, and technology are introduced. From that moment on, each new generation of this car becomes a manifesto of how the brand understands the future of the automobile. The first official S-Class, the WW116 series, gathers the fruits of years of work in safety. Its design integrates door protection bars, reinforced structures, perfected deformation zones, and improved active safety elements. The anti-lock braking system is offered as an option, preventing the wheels from locking during hard braking and allowing the driver to retain the ability to steer around obstacles. The idea that a car can think about how it brakes fascinates more informed customers and gradually becomes a selling point in a market where competition is intensifying. With the W116, Mercedes Benz makes it clear that its upper range is defined not only by luxury, but by placing drivers and passengers in a technically more protected environment than average. In the 1980s, the next generation of the S-Class, the WW126, deepens that philosophy with a carefully studied balance between elegance, aerodynamic efficiency, and technical advances. The body is designed not only to be attractive, but also to reduce air resistance and improve high-speed stability. Inside, new materials appear intended to absorb impacts. Seat belts are refined in their anchoring points and tensioning systems. And once again, innovations that sound like the future are introduced. The driver airbag first, and later the passenger airbag, accompanied by belt pretensioners that activate in thousandths of a second. Once again, the S-Class becomes a showcase of what is yet to come, a kind of window into technologies that will later be incorporated into more affordable models. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the strategy Mercedes-Benz follows with safety and advanced engineering is particularly interesting. It assumes that developing these technologies in the upper range is expensive, slow, and full of uncertainty, but understands that if it succeeds in consolidating a reputation for technical leadership, that investment will be more than recovered in terms of brand strength, customer loyalty, and pricing power. The S-Class functions as a spearhead, a high-margin product that finances development and, at the same time, serves as a testing platform for systems that will eventually become standard, from anti-lock brakes to airbags, including electronic stability controls and increasingly sophisticated driving assistance systems. This approach also reinforces a narrative that aligns with what many people expect from the brand. When someone considers buying a Mercedes, especially in the higher segments, they are not only looking to move from one point to another, they want to feel they are investing in a kind of technological insurance, in a car that has been designed to help when things become complicated on the road, whether it is an unexpected situation on a long journey or a sudden stop in the city. Advertising, without being alarmist, insists on these ideas. High-speed stability on German highways without speed limits, structures that protect the family, devices that intervene when human reflexes are not enough. As the 20th century advances, safety shifts from being a differentiating feature to becoming a basic market requirement. But the advantage built by Mercedes-Benz during the decades of Bahraini, of the first crash tests, and of the pioneering generations of the S-Class grants it an authority that is difficult to replicate. Each new assistance system, each improvement in brakes, each structural reinforcement is perceived as part of a tradition, not as an isolated idea. The brand thus achieves something many companies pursue without success: having customers see innovation as a continuity of values, not as a change of direction that must be evaluated from scratch. While the luxury sedans bearing the star consolidate that role as a technical reference, the world opens toward increasingly distant markets, trade routes that require adapted products, global service networks, and a broader vision of the automobile business that goes beyond Europe and the United States. And in that new stage, the combination of safety, engineering, and prestige built around the S-Class will serve as a calling card in places where the brand is only beginning to write its story. Global expansion, trucks, and diversification. When the S-Class begins to consolidate itself as a symbol of technological luxury in Europe and the United States. Inside Mercedes Benz, it is already very clear that the financial heart of the company also beats in other, less glamorous places. Places where bodywork does not shine under showroom lights, but instead travels dirt roads, carries tons of goods, or spends entire days on urban routes, stopping and starting without rest. During the 1960s and 1970s, the brand understands that its future cannot depend solely on high-end passenger cars, no matter how prestigious they may be. And it decisively turns toward a global expansion supported by three pillars that feed into one another: trucks, buses, and an intelligent diversification toward products adapted to specific markets. In advanced post-war Europe, trade accelerates. Supply chains need to move with a regularity that would have been unthinkable 30 years earlier. And trucks become the backbone of this new economy. For a transport entrepreneur, choosing a vehicle is not an aesthetic whim. It is a decision that can sink or save a business, because delivery deadlines, maintenance costs, and ultimately customer trust all depend on the reliability of the truck. Mercedes Benz identifies this critical point and commits itself to building a range of industrial vehicles that embody the same idea of solidity associated with its passenger cars, but applied to a much harsher world, where every kilometer is measured in money earned or lost. Trucks bearing the star begin to appear everywhere. On construction sites, on mountain roads, crossing borders, pulling trailers full of raw materials or manufactured goods. From light models designed for urban delivery to multi-ton giants that cross the continent. The range expands without losing technical coherence. With robust diesel engines, transmissions designed to withstand constant abuse, and cabins that, over the years, incorporate improvements in ergonomics and safety for drivers who spend half their working lives on board. Each time these vehicles withstand the years of extreme use without major failures, they reinforce a reputation that translates into new contracts and an almost inevitable presence in professional fleets. At the same time, the bus business becomes another fundamental piece of expansion. Cities grow, public transport becomes an urgent necessity, and many local administrations in Europe, Latin America, Africa, or Asia need complete solutions. It is not enough to buy vehicles. They need service guarantees, spare parts, mechanic training, and even advice on how to organize routes. Mercedes Benz enters this field with an offering that goes far beyond the simple chassis, providing configurations adapted to different conditions. From urban models designed for passengers to get on and off every few meters to long-distance coaches that travel for hours along endless roads. This combination of trucks and buses opens the door to something that will be decisive for the next phase: industrial internationalization. The company understands that exporting vehicles from Germany to the entire world has economic and political limits, and that the next logical step is to produce close to the destination markets. Assembly plants begin to emerge in key countries, sometimes through licensing agreements, other times through joint subsidiaries, where kits sent from Europe are assembled or components are manufactured locally. Brazil becomes one of the most significant examples. There, for decades, trucks and buses with a star on the grille will be an inseparable part of the landscape. Central pieces of the country's economic infrastructure, from urban transport to agribusiness. This model is replicated with variations in other regions. In some countries of North Africa, local assembly programs are developed that allow governments to present the project as a step toward industrialization, while Mercedes-Benz secures commercial presence, access to public contracts, and a strategic gateway to regional markets. In Asia, where demographic and urban growth accelerates dramatically, the brand positions itself as a supplier of buses and industrial vehicles that make it possible to articulate new metropolises in full expansion. Each plant, each agreement, each maintenance contract reinforces the idea of a company that no longer thinks in national terms, but in global ones. Of course, this expansion is not sustained solely by industrial vehicles. Diversification also enters the field of special and niche products. The Unimog, for example, that singular off-road vehicle with enormous capabilities beyond paved roads, initially designed for agricultural and military use, ends up finding application in countless sectors. Infrastructure maintenance, emergency services, forestry, scientific expeditions. Environments where a machine capable of advancing where others get stuck is required. This type of product, with modest sales volumes but enormous symbolic weight, helps consolidate the image of Mercedes Benz as a manufacturer capable of solving complex problems with ingenious solutions. The business of industrial engines is also strengthened. Produced for ships, heavy machinery, or stationary equipment, this type of activity, less visible to the general public, adds a layer of stability to the company's accounts because it diversifies sources of income and reduces dependence on passenger car market cycles. In times of recession, when private customers hold back, contracts with power generation companies, shipping firms, or large industrial operations can make the difference between a mediocre year and an acceptable one. In the field of passenger cars, global expansion forces an understanding of very different cultures and usage habits. In some countries, a Mercedes is perceived primarily as a vehicle for government representation. In others, as a work tool in the form of an almost indestructible diesel taxi. In others, as an object of desire for an emerging middle class that sees the star as a way to signal social ascent. The company learns to modulate its range to adapt to these expectations without betraying its identity, offering lower displacement versions with restrained equipment in price-sensitive markets, while maintaining high-end products for clients seeking something extraordinary. The commercial network becomes a strategic element of the highest order. It is not enough to sell a car or a truck. It must be guaranteed that 10 years later there will still be spare parts, trained mechanics, and clear repair protocols. Mercedes Benz invests in creating dealerships and authorized workshops that act as ambassadors for the brand, selects local partners, establishes service standards, and supervises that the customer experience aligns with what is expected from a manufacturer that has made quality its banner. This vision, which may seem obvious today, requires enormous discipline when deployed on a planetary scale, with cultural, regulatory, and economic differences in each country. In parallel, the company strengthens its financial structure to facilitate access to its products. Leasing and financing divisions are created that allow companies and individuals to acquire vehicles through structured payments, something especially relevant in the field of trucks and buses, where initial investments are very high. By offering integrated packages that combine vehicle, maintenance, and financing, Mercedes Benz becomes more than a simple seller of machines, a business partner for transport operators, bus line companies, or logistics firms that plan their costs over the long term. All of this international deployment has an evident consequence. The company becomes larger, more complex, and more exposed to what happens in any corner of the planet. Economic cycles, oil crises, currency fluctuations, and the emergence of competitors in markets where there was previously little supply begin to affect its results directly. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Japanese brands break forcefully into the global market with efficient, reliable, and often more affordable products. And the idea that historical prestige alone is enough to secure the future becomes dangerously naive. The star has extended its light across half the world. But that same size means that any strategic error, any loss of focus, has multiplied consequences. Something that will become very clear in the decades that follow, when the company is forced to respond to fierce competition and to an industrial environment undergoing rapid transformation. Crisis, Japanese competition, and the merger with Chrysler. At the beginning of the 1980s, when the automotive world seems divided between those who advance with an almost surgical industrial discipline and those who rely on the strength of their tradition to stay the course, Mercedes Benz begins to feel a tremor coming from afar. From a country that decades earlier had been little more than a discreet presence in European automobile catalogs. Japan. Japanese brands burst onto the scene with a different philosophy, a culture of continuous improvement that translates into cars that are reliable, efficient, and surprisingly well built for their price. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, each with its own style, begin to gain ground among consumers who value durability, low maintenance costs, and the feeling that the automobile has ceased to be a luxury and has become a sophisticated household appliance. Meanwhile, Mercedes Benz remains a name loaded with prestige, but its internal structures show symptoms of wear. The company carries an operational complexity that makes it difficult to react quickly, maintains processes that work because they have always worked, and trusts that its reputation will be enough to justify high prices and wide margins. For years, that formula was sufficient, because customers accepted paying more to access a brand with decades of excellence. But the new competition raises an uncomfortable comparison. What happens if a cheaper car offers a similar perceived quality in daily use? The internal reports that reached the directors in Stuttgart during that decade are not easy to digest. There are signs that some components do not maintain the standard that customers associate with Mercedes-Benz. Corrosion problems are detected in certain models, fittings that do not match the usual precision, materials that age prematurely. None of this destroys the reputation overnight. But it does silently erode a trust that had taken generations to build. The customer who once bought a Mercedes, convinced of its objective superiority, now begins to look around with greater attention. The pressure intensifies in the United States, a crucial market for the brand. The Japanese not only compete, they also conquer segments that once seemed exclusive territory of Europeans and Americans. Lexus, the luxury division of Toyota, appears at the end of the 1980s to challenge the space where the S-Class reigned, and its strategy proves lethal. An impeccable product, an after-sales service new to the standards of the time, and a price that is hard to ignore. In a matter of years, that competition forces Mercedes-Benz to look into an uncomfortable mirror, one that reveals that size, history, and reputation no longer guarantee victory in a global market that rewards efficiency. The company tries to respond by strengthening quality controls, accelerating modernization processes, and developing models that reflect a more contemporary approach. But transforming an organization of that size is a monumental task. In addition, the industry as a whole begins to experience profound changes. Supply chains globalize, environmental regulations raise costs, technological expectations grow, and margins shrink in segments where they were once comfortable. Manufacturers seek volume, alliances, shared platforms, any tool that allows them to survive in a race that no longer depends only on technical talent, but also on the ability to manage gigantic structures and unpredictable markets. In that context, an idea emerges that at the time seems bold and almost visionary: joining forces with an American manufacturer to create a giant capable of competing with an advantage on all continents. The piece that appears on the table is Chrysler, a North American company with a history marked by UPS and downs, capable of launching memorable models, but also vulnerable to economic fluctuations. At the end of the 1990s, Chrysler seems to have recovered its energy thanks to the success of some strategic products, and its presence in the United States proves tempting for Mercedes Benz, which seeks a fast path to increase its industrial scale without giving up technological control. The conversations move forward with a mixture of enthusiasm and pragmatism. Executives present the operation as a merger of equals, although from the beginning it is evident that Daimler carries greater financial and technological weight. A union based on synergies is promised, sharing platforms, reducing costs, accelerating new developments, and creating an automotive group that combines German engineering with American productive and commercial capacity. In 1998, the creation of Daimler Chrysler is officially announced, a move that shakes the industry and that many analysts celebrate as the birth of a new giant capable of competing against Japanese brands and traditional American manufacturers. In the first months, the public narrative speaks of complementarity and a bright future. But within the new structure, tensions emerge that soon demonstrate that a merger cannot be sustained solely by financial balances and well-crafted speeches. German and American corporate cultures collide on deep levels: management styles, priorities, rhythms, and labor expectations. For some Chrysler employees, Daimler is perceived as a dominant force, more interested in absorbing than in merging. For German executives, the American company appears undisciplined, too flexible, and with less rigorous processes. The promise of synergies runs into the reality of integrating two gigantic systems that do not share the same DNA. Joint projects advance more slowly than expected. Some ambitious plans end up coming to nothing, and concern begins to seep into internal reports and into statements by financial analysts. The American side faces growing difficulties in a market that becomes more competitive, while Daimler must invest more effort than anticipated to sustain areas it had expected to receive already stabilized. The dream of a global conglomerate begins to show cracks. The numbers do not add up with the anticipated speed, internal tensions do not dissipate, and the sense that the merger of equals has turned into a complicated acquisition gains ground. For Mercedes Benz, the risk is also reputational. The luxury brand, synonymous with precision and excellence, now coexists under the same corporate umbrella with products of very different characteristics. And that coexistence generates questions among customers, distributors, and shareholders. In the middle of the 2000s, when the situation at Chrysler becomes unsustainable, Daimler decides that the only viable exit is to divest most of its participation. The operation, announced in 2007, puts an end to an experiment that had been presented as a perfect marriage, but that, over time, revealed itself as a union full of structural frictions. For many historians of the industry, this episode becomes a lesson about the limits of mergers in the automotive sector. Engineering can be integrated, processes can be unified, but corporate culture is an organism that is difficult to transplant. Mercedes Benz emerges from that chapter with several important lessons. First, it confirms that globalization requires alliances, but that not all alliances are a direct path to efficiency. Second, it discovers that protecting brand identity is essential, especially when operating within large conglomerates where the homogeneous can devour the distinctive. And third, it understands that competitive pressure demands constant reinvention, a discipline that cannot always be accelerated through mergers or acquisitions. Once the Daimler-Chrysler stage is closed, the company reorganizes its structure under the name Daimler AG, focusing on revitalizing the Mercedes-Benz range, strengthening its role in the premium market, investing in technology, and recovering the strategic clarity that had been diluted amid so many corporate moves. That reorientation opens the door to a new phase in which the brand will seek to modernize its image, energize its catalog, and connect with a global audience that expected from the star something more than historical prestige. Reinventing itself. Modern luxury, AMG, and Maybach. When the Daimler Chrysler era comes to an end, and the group reorganizes itself once again as Daimler AG. At the beginning of the 21st century, the feeling inside the company is a strange one. On the one hand, a giant with an immense history and unquestionable engineering capability is still standing. But on the other, the automotive world is no longer the same. Customers have changed, competition has become more sophisticated, and the brand runs the risk of being perceived as something respected, yet distant, almost old-fashioned. BMW and Audi have gained enormous ground with younger products and aggressive communication. Japanese manufacturers have penetrated the premium segment with dedicated divisions. And at the same time, luxury itself is starting to be understood in a different way. Less rigid, less tied exclusively to solemnity. In that context, Mercedes Benz is forced to ask itself an uncomfortable question: how to remain the reference without becoming trapped in its own past? The answer arrives in the form of a conceptual shift. From the executive level onward, people begin to talk about modern luxury, an expression that, beyond the label, reflects a profound change in attitude. The brand wants to preserve its aura of quality and prestige, but aligned with a more emotional, more fluid style, less formally hierarchical. Exterior design softens, lines become more muscular and dynamic, silhouettes appear that play with sportiness without renouncing elegance. A clear precedent had been the CLS in the early 2000s, that four-door coupe that broke the mold of the classic sedan and proved that a Mercedes could attract customers who previously looked toward brands with a bolder visual language. From there, the design team led by Gordon Wagoner pushes that vision across the entire range, building a recognizable aesthetic that links the star to something more vital, less solemn. In parallel, a component that had been growing for years and now moves to center stage is reinforced. AMG. What had begun in the 1960s as an external workshop preparing Mercedes cars for competition, and which over time became integrated into the group, consolidates itself as a high-performance division with a very strong identity. Models signed by AMG, with their blend of enormous engines, almost theatrical sound, and behavior tuned for passionate drivers, become the most exciting face of the brand. A C-Class or an E-Class can be serene vehicles in their conventional versions, but in the hands of AMG, they turn into machines with volcanic character, capable of standing up to pure sports cars while still offering a comfortable, well-finished interior. That contrast makes many people who would never have thought of a Mercedes as an exciting car start to see it with different eyes. AMG does not contribute only horsepower and noise, it contributes a different narrative. Behind every engine signed by hand by a technician in a Falterbach, there is a story of mechanical craftsmanship in times of mass production, a kind of bridge between the old racing tuner workshop and the contemporary world of electronics and telemetry. The brand exploits that duality intelligently, associating AMG models with track imagery, more relaxed campaigns, and customer experiences where cars drift on icy circuits or run laps at Nürburgring. That type of activity helps Mercedes stop being perceived solely as the car of the serious executive and become associated as well with adrenaline, exhaust noise, and a passion for driving. At the top of the luxury spectrum, however, the story is different. At the beginning of the 2000s, the group decides to revive a name loaded with history: Maybach. The idea is to compete head-to-head with Rolls-Royce and Bentley, with a separate brand, positioned above Mercedes Benz, with models such as the Maybach 57 and 62. Enormous limousines with sumptuous interiors, designed for an extremely limited audience. Technically, the vehicles are impressive, exquisite in their finishes, absurdly quiet. But they encounter a difficult problem to solve. Visually, they resemble a stretched S-Class too closely, and in a segment where symbolic exclusivity is everything, that stylistic proximity is perceived as a weakness. Added to this is the financial crisis of 2008, which hits the hyper-luxury market hard, and the result is that Maybach, as an independent brand, never fully takes off. The reaction to that setback is one of the most intelligent moves of the company's recent era. Instead of burying the name, Daimler decides to reposition it. Maybach ceases to be a separate brand and becomes a kind of super layer within the Mercedes universe, giving rise to Mercedes Maybach versions of the S-Class, the GLS sport utility vehicle, and other models. In other words, the customer no longer feels that they are moving away from Mercedes. They feel that they are accessing the very top of the star's pyramid. The approach works far better because it leverages the strength of the main brand and combines it with an extra degree of luxury, personalization, and presence in markets where ultra-exclusivity carries enormous social weight, such as China, the Middle East, or Russia. The lesson is clear. Sometimes the dream of building a parallel universe of extreme luxury works worse than reinforcing the narrative of an already established brand. While all this happens at the top of the catalog, the base expands. New segments emerge with which, a few years earlier, no one would have associated the Mercedes name. Compacts such as the A-Class and the B-Class, stylized sedans like the CLA, sport utility vehicles of all sizes, from the GLA to the Giants GL and GLS, passing through the GLC, which carry the star to young families, urban professionals, and customers seeking something aspirational, though less inaccessible than a large sedan. This relative democratization has a double effect. On the one hand, it massively expands sales volume and allows the customer base to be rejuvenated. On the other, it forces constant reflection on the risk of diluting the brand if certain limits are crossed. Managing that tension between exclusivity and expansion is one of the central challenges of leadership in these years. The way luxury is understood inside the car also changes radically. For decades, the sensation of quality was associated with leather, wood, perfect fit and finish, and silence. Now software, screens, connectivity, and assistance systems must be added, turning the cabin into a digital space. Mercedes Benz understands this and turns the interior into its new battlefield. Infotainment systems evolve toward more intuitive interfaces. Large integrated screens appear, ambient lighting allows the atmosphere to be personalized, voice assistants respond to natural commands, and integration with the phone, the cloud, and online services becomes ever deeper. The idea of luxury is reformulated. It is no longer only about traveling comfortably. It is about feeling accompanied by a technology that understands the driver, assists them, and entertains them smoothly. This radical digitalization, which will later crystallize in systems such as MBUX, is supported by something the brand had been developing for decades: electronics applied to safety and comfort. The step from anti-lock braking systems and stability control toward lane-keeping assistance, adaptive cruise control, automatic emergency braking, or almost autonomous parking systems is carried out gradually, with the S-Class and other high-end models as pioneers, and with the rest of the range progressively receiving the same functions. In this way, the company manages to keep alive the narrative that has accompanied it since Bertha. Each generation of cars incorporates additional layers of protection, even if the wrapping is now far more digital. On the geographic level, the center of gravity of the premium market begins to shift. China moves from being an emerging customer to becoming one of the pillars of the global business. Mercedes Benz responds with an aggressive strategy. Long wheelbase versions designed specifically for that market. Local factories in cooperation with Chinese partners. Dealer networks that combine the feel of a luxury boutique with the scale demanded by a country of that magnitude. In parallel, other key markets are carefully tended, from the United States to the Middle East, where the brand maintains a very visible presence in high purchasing power segments. Each region requires a different nuance in the value proposition, from an emphasis on rear seat comfort for chauffeur-driven clients to a focus on performance for buyers who want to drive themselves. At the end of this stage, as the decade of the 2000s closes and the next one opens with growing debates about emissions, climate change, and new forms of mobility, Mercedes-Benz reaches a curious point in its history. It has modernized its design, rejuvenated its customer base, strengthened its sporting image with AMG, repositioned Maybach as the pinnacle of luxury, and embraced the digital interior as its new playing field. But all that effort at reinvention collides with a reality that becomes more evident every day. The world is beginning to look at the internal combustion engine and the model of car ownership with different eyes. And the prestige of the past will not be enough to lead the transition toward a form of mobility in which electricity, software, and new regulations will set the rhythm. Toward full electrification and the future of software. As the calendar moves into the decade of 2010 and the automobile industry faces a profound questioning, from emissions to vehicle ownership, including the arrival of new technological competitors, Mercedes-Benz enters a period that demands a blend of courage, humility, and strategic vision. The rules of the game are no longer the same ones that dominated for a century. The heart of the business begins to shift from mechanics to software, from the roar of an engine to electric silence, from the idea of owning a car to concepts such as shared, connected, and automated mobility. And in this turbulent scenario, the brand of the star is forced to decide what it wants to be for the rest of the 21st century. The first challenge becomes evident with regulatory pressure. Europe approves increasingly strict emissions limits. The United States debates ambitious regulations. And China promotes an industrial ecosystem that clearly encourages electrification. For a traditional manufacturer, accustomed to perfecting combustion engines over generations, this change represents both an emotional and technical earthquake. However, Mercedes-Benz understands that resistance is not viable. Electricity is not an experiment. It is the new foundation on which the reputation of the modern automobile will be built. In the middle of the 2010 decade, the company takes a decisive step and announces its EQ sub-brand, a platform designed to group everything related to electric mobility. At that moment, uncertainty still exists about the real speed of change. But inside offices in Stuttgart, there is already a strong conviction that the future is not hybrid. It is electric. The first major showcase is the EQC, a sport utility vehicle that inaugurates the new era with familiar aesthetics, silent driving, and a strong commitment to internal digitalization. Although it does not solve every challenge, especially weight and driving range, it represents a clear message to the market. The star does not intend to watch from the sidelines while others lead the transition. From there, a frenetic race begins in which the company invests billions in dedicated electric platforms, batteries, software, strategic alliances, and production centers adapted to a type of engineering that bears little resemblance to the past. Battery factories are built in Europe. Historic plants are reorganized, and entire assembly lines are redesigned to accommodate fully electric vehicles. The focus is no longer to develop a car and then electrify it, but to think from the ground up about an architecture capable of taking advantage of weight distribution, structural rigidity, and the spatial possibilities of an electric platform. The turning point arrives with the EQS, the electric sibling of the S-Class, the car that symbolizes the most ambitious attempt to transfer the spirit of the flagship sedan into a universe where diesel or gasoline engines no longer have a role. The EQS is not presented as a technological experiment, but as a declaration of intent. Extreme aerodynamic design aimed at maximizing driving range, an interior dominated by the hyperscreen, a panel that merges multiple displays into a vast digital canvas, and software management based on remote updates that transform the vehicle over time. It is a deep conceptual shift. A Mercedes is no longer defined only by what it brings from the factory, but by what it can become years later. Software begins to occupy a central place in the business structure. The company announces that it will develop its own in-house vehicle operating system, betting on a vision in which the car resembles an intelligent device more than a purely mechanical apparatus. This decision, costly and risky, seeks to regain control over the user experience, something many manufacturers had ceded for years to external suppliers. Mercedes Benz understands that in the new mobility, whoever controls the software will control the relationship with the customer, because that entity will manage navigation, infotainment, safety, updates, and, in the near future, autonomous driving functions. This new approach requires surrounding oneself with allies. The company establishes technological agreements with giants such as NVIDIA to develop advanced driver assistance systems and real-time processing capabilities. Investments of this kind mark a paradigm shift. Innovation no longer depends solely on mechanical engineers. It now requires multidisciplinary teams where programmers, artificial intelligence specialists, user interface experts, and data analysts work side by side. The car factory becomes a software factory, and each vehicle generates an immense flow of information that can be used to improve safety, optimize energy consumption, or anticipate failures. But the advance toward electrification is not limited to passenger cars. Mercedes Benz applies the same logic to its industrial division, electrifying trucks and vans, aware that urban and logistics transport will be one of the major fields of transformation. Models such as the e-Sprinter or the first proposals for heavy-duty electric trucks are presented as signals that the company wants to lead the transition, also in sectors where range, payload, and charging times represent much tougher challenges. The strategy does not consist of waiting for infrastructure to be ready, but of pushing for it to evolve at the same pace as the vehicles. In parallel, an internal debate emerges about brand identity. Electrification changes sound, throttle response, and the physical sensation of driving. The question is how to maintain the emotional essence of Mercedes-Benz in a world where the engine no longer roars, but whispers. Exterior design responds with more fluid lines, clean surfaces, and an almost sculptural aesthetic that continues the idea of modern luxury, now adapted to the demands of wind and energy efficiency. Inside, luxury is redefined through sensory experience, sustainable materials, immersive lighting, and a digital ecosystem that acts as a personal assistant. The car ceases to be a machine and becomes an experiential space. This process also forces a respectful look back, but without paralyzing nostalgia. Models such as the G-Class, an an icon that seems immune to the passage of time, receive electric versions that seek to preserve their character without abandoning the new philosophy. The same happens with AMG, which prepares for a future where performance will be defined by electric motors and by software that distributes torque with millimetric precision between axles and wheels. Emotion does not disappear, it transforms. On the corporate level, Mercedes Benz reorganizes its structure to focus almost entirely on passenger cars and vans, separating the truck division into an independent company. This move makes it possible to concentrate investments and resources on electrification and digitalization of the automobile, without constantly balancing the priorities of industrial segments with different development cycles. The strategy shows a clarity that had been lacking in other periods. Each line of business must have a clear direction. Toward the end of the 2020 decade, the company announces a goal that definitively marks its roadmap: to become fully electric, where market conditions allow. A carefully chosen phrase that acknowledges global differences while making the final destination clear. The industry no longer advances at the pace dictated by each manufacturer. It advances at the pace demanded by the planet. Regulations, younger consumers, technological advances, and climate reality all push in the same direction. And the company that for more than a century defined the luxury automobile now prepares to define what that luxury will be in an electrified world. And while this transition advances at a speed that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, the company is already analyzing the next challenge: how to integrate artificial intelligence, autonomous driving, and connected services without losing the essence of a brand that was born from mechanical ingenuity, but now reinvents itself to embrace a future where software will be as decisive as traditional engineering. Current challenges and the future of the star. In this recent stage, while headlines speak of electrification, artificial intelligence, and new brands appearing as if the sector had turned into a kind of Silicon Valley on wheels, Mercedes Benz moves on delicate ground, where it must defend a legacy of more than a century and at the same time make decisions that break with many of the certainties that once took it to the top. The company no longer competes only with traditional manufacturers. It now faces technology firms that understand the car as a connected device, hyper-aggressive Chinese giants in terms of price and development speed, and a generation of customers who value sustainability, digital experience, and flexibility almost as much as the prestige of a logo on the grille. On this board, choosing the wrong bet means losing entire years, and the margin for business romanticism is minimal. One of the brand's major strategic dilemmas has been deciding which part of the market it truly wants to fight in. For decades, Mercedes-Benz expanded downward with increasingly accessible, compact models, designed to attract a younger audience that saw the star as an attainable goal. However, cost pressure, the emergence of competitors that manufacture more cheaply, and margin erosion in entry segments have led management to a deep reassessment. It is better to be fewer things, but very clearly defined, than to try to cover everything at the expense of sacrificing identity. This translates into announcements that the brand will orient itself more strongly toward luxury, reducing complexity in entry-level models and concentrating efforts on higher ranges, large sport utility vehicles, and vehicles where technological and image differentiation are more evident. At the same time, the war for the electric car has introduced a new set of adversaries that move at an unsettling speed. Chinese manufacturers that were unknown only a few years ago are launching products with attractive designs, abundant technology, and aggressive pricing, supported by highly optimized battery supply chains and, in many cases, by very favorable industrial policies. For a group like Mercedes-Benz, accustomed to leading the conversation, being forced to respond at the pace of actors that operate with almost no past and with lighter structures represents an enormous cultural shock. The company is pushed to revise development timelines, simplify platforms, share certain components, and even consider alliances with those who, on paper, are competitors, all in order to gain time in a transition where years of advantage weigh more than decades of history. Another decisive front is software and services. In the world of the classic automobile, the relationship with the customer began with the sale of the vehicle and continued in the workshop, with periodic maintenance and repairs. Today, the ideal relationship is far denser, because the car is connected to the cloud, receives data and sends it, updates itself, unlocks new functions, integrates with applications, and in some cases, even allows certain features to be activated through subscriptions. This approach opens a vast range of recurring business opportunities, but it also poses a delicate challenge for a luxury brand. How to monetize software without making the customer feel that they are paying for pieces of a car they have already purchased at a high price. Debates about heated seats or performance features limited by subscription have made it clear that the line between innovation and business models and a feeling of abuse is very thin. And Mercedes Benz must play this game with more tact than others, because its audience demands coherence between price, digital experience, and the dignity of the product. Sustainability, for its part, is no longer an optional chapter in annual reports. It is a central axis of the value proposition. The luxury of the future, as the brand attempts to present it, must be compatible with an increasingly widespread environmental awareness, and that affects everything, from the origin of battery raw materials to recycling processes. Through the use of less harmful interior materials, alternatives to traditional leather, and factories powered by renewable energy, the idea being communicated is simple, although difficult to execute. A car can offer extreme comfort, silence, power, and sophisticated details without being a symbol of irresponsible excess. This narrative is built with advertising, yes, but above all, with industrial and supply chain decisions that have real consequences, both in costs and in complexity. Added to this landscape is the challenge of automated driving. Mercedes Benz has been one of the actors most insistent on the need to advance increasingly capable assistance systems, with specific approvals in some countries for levels in which the car assumes certain functions in controlled environments, such as congested highways. The bet is clear. If for decades the differentiating value was protection in the event of an accident, now it will be the ability to avoid it thanks to sensors, radars, cameras, high-definition maps, and algorithms that make decisions in fractions of a second. But this field is crossed by immense legal, ethical, and liability issues. Each advance requires dialogue with regulators, the assumption of new reputational risks, and the management of expectations inflated by the marketing of other players who promise fully autonomous futures, while technical reality is not yet there. Being prudent while remaining innovative is a difficult tightrope to walk. Within the organization itself, the changes are also profound. Mechanical engineers who for years were the center of the universe see programmers, data specialists, and user experience experts gain weight in organizational charts. The traditional factory coexists with software development centers, where the rhythm is set by sprints and agile methodologies, not by 5 or 7 year cycles. For a company accustomed to planning over very long horizons, this new tempo may seem chaotic, but it is the only way to compete in an ecosystem where digital standards change faster than engine generations. The challenge is cultural. Integrating this agility without losing the rigor required to build machines that weigh tons and travel at high speeds with people inside. All of this also takes place in a market where the end customer no longer has a single way of understanding mobility. Some people still want a car in full ownership, while others prefer monthly subscriptions, flexible leasing, limited time access, or combining car use with other modes of transport, from electric bicycles to high-speed trains. Mercedes Benz experiments with mobility services, car-sharing platforms, proposals for companies that manage fleets dynamically, and asks itself how much of its business, in a few years, will be product sales, and how much will be the sale of services associated with that product. This question, behind its technical appearance, contains an identity issue. What it means to be a car brand when the car is increasingly a node within a broader system. From an entrepreneurial perspective, what is fascinating about this moment is that the company is pushed to behave, in some respects, like a young firm inside a gigantic body with more than 130 years of history behind it. It must accept that some deeply rooted ideas have expired, that reverence for the past cannot block unpopular decisions in the present, that it will be necessary to abandon models, technologies, and even segments that once defined internal pride. At the same time, it has the privilege of starting from a brand base that millions of people associate with trust, quality, and safety, an intangible capital that many new competitors will take decades to build, if they manage to do so at all. The history of Mercedes Benz, seen as a whole, resembles a continuous journey between risk and adaptation. From Carl Benz's workshop to hyper-automated factories, from Bertha's clandestine journey to autonomous driving tests, from Daimler and Maybach racing engines to software-managed electric platforms. The current challenges, and those yet to come, will be no smaller than those faced by those early pioneers. The tools will change, the language will change, business models will change. But the entrepreneurial essence of the brand, that mixture of technical stubbornness and the ability to read the time in which it lives, will determine whether the star continues to shine on the new map of mobility or is reduced to a symbol of a century already past. I hope you have enjoyed this deep journey through the history of one of the most emblematic brands in the world. I would love to read you in the comments. Tell me which part surprised you the most and which other stories you would like us to investigate together. If you are not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so you do not miss the upcoming documentaries on the channel. Thank you for joining me one more night. Good night.